The hands told the story first. Large, dark, deliberate hands, pressing a soaking chamois cloth against the hood of a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro SS. The wet black paint catching the early Saturday morning sun in a way that turned the whole car into something that looked less like an automobile and more like a piece of the night sky that had somehow come to rest on a residential driveway in Calverton, Virginia, and decided to stay. There was no hurry in those hands. That was the first thing you would have noticed if you had been walking past Whitmore Lane at 7:45 on that particular October morning, the air still carrying that specific autumn crispness that arrives in Virginia like a polite houseguest, cool and clean and gone by noon. The hands moved in slow, wide circles across the hood, working the chamois from the center outward, overlapping each pass by an inch, the way a craftsman works, rather than a man in a rush. And the sound of it was a soft, wet rhythm against the metal, punctuated by the distant call of a mockingbird in the oak tree at the property line, and the gentle drip of the garden hose coiled across the concrete at the edge of the driveway. The smell of carnauba wax was strong and sweet in the morning air, mixing with the October leaves and the faint, faraway scent of someone else's coffee brewing somewhere down the block. And the whole scene had the quality of something deeply private, a man alone with the thing he loved best in the world, on a morning that belonged entirely to him. He was wearing a faded Howard University t-shirt that had once been a rich burgundy and was now somewhere closer to the color of old brick, soft and thin from years of washing, the letters across the chest still visible, but surrendering to time. Dark athletic shorts, the kind that had survived a dozen different decades of use, scuffed New Balance sneakers that had seen better years and didn't seem to mind. A man, dressed in other words exactly the way a man dresses when he is not performing anything for anyone, when the morning is his own and the only audience is the car. The Camaro was midnight black, so deep and clean it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The chrome bumpers polished to a mirror finish that doubled the oak trees and the morning sky back on themselves. It was a 1969 model, the year the design reached what many considered its absolute peak, before the decade turned and everything changed. And it had been restored by hand over 3 winters in a rented garage space in the Eastbrook neighborhood. The owner on his back under the frame on cold weekend mornings, with a trouble light and tools he had learned to use by doing rather than by being taught, which is the only way some things can be learned. The man's name was Darius Cole, and he was 52 years old. And the badge and the command credentials and the entire professional identity that defined every other hour of his life were sitting on the kitchen counter inside the house behind him, which was exactly where he had left them when he walked out the front door, 40 minutes ago, with a bucket of soapy water and the chamois and the particular kind of freedom that comes from a Saturday morning with nowhere to be and no one to answer to. He was broad through the shoulders, in the way that comes not from a gym, but from the natural settling of a large frame into itself over decades. The kind of build that made chairs look slightly too small for him. And his close-cropped hair was mostly gray now at the temples, the gray spreading inward like winter coming in from the edges of a field. His face was not a young man's face, but it was a strong one, with the kind of lines that suggested a life spent paying attention to difficult things. And his eyes, when he looked up, were the kind of dark, quiet, unhurried eyes that made people in rooms feel like he had already considered every possible version of what they were about to say. He was not looking up just now. He was working the passenger side of the hood, the chamois moving in its steady circles, and he was thinking about almost nothing, which was the rarest and most valuable state of mind available to a man in his position. And he was protecting it the way you protect the last match in a box of matches. The Camaro was not just a car, and it had never been just a car. He had bought it the chassis, technically a rusted shell, without an engine or an interior, with the first paycheck he received after making detective. And the decision had been impulsive in a way that almost nothing else in his life had ever been. A sudden, fierce claiming of something beautiful, for no reason other than that he wanted it, and had earned the right to want things. He had spent those 3 winters in the Eastbrook garage, learning the language of the car from the inside out. And the years of that restoration were the last years he could remember being purely, uncomplicatedly happy, without the happiness being complicated by anything that came after. The hose dripped. The mockingbird called. The chamois moved. At the far end of Whitmore Lane, where the street curved gently to the right before it met the intersection with Caldwell Avenue, a patrol cruiser turned the corner at a rolling, unhurried pace and began moving up the block, its tires barely audible on the morning pavement, the light bar dark, the engine at idle. Darius registered it the way he registered everything, peripherally, automatically, without alarm, and went back to the hood. He had 2 more panels to finish before the left rear wheel well. His mother's hands had smelled like antiseptic soap for as long as he could remember. Gloria Cole had been a home health aide for 23 years, and the smell of the antiseptic traveled with her the way perfume travels with other women, embedded in the fabric of her clothes and the creases of her palms, and the air around her when she sat down at the kitchen table after a 12-hour shift and took her shoes off with that specific sigh that Darius, as a child, had come to understand meant the day was finally, mercifully over. She had been a small woman, his mother smaller than he expected mothers to be when he got old enough to compare them, with quick, dark eyes that missed nothing, and a way of holding herself very straight, even when she was tired, but had communicated to him from the time he was old enough to understand communication, that dignity was not something you were given. It was something you maintained, every day, in every room, regardless of who was watching and who was not. They had lived in Eastwick, in the eastern part of Philadelphia, in a neighborhood that appeared in city planning documents as economically distressed, and appeared in his mother's prayers every night simply as home, because whatever it was where she was raising her son, and she was not going to apologize to anyone for the address. Eastwick in the 1980s was not a gentle place to grow up. There were corners that belonged to men his mother told him to walk past without looking, and there were schools where the teachers were exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with their students, and everything to do with the systems that had placed them there and left them without resources. And there was the particular quiet that settled over certain blocks after 9 o'clock at night that was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of people who had learned to stay inside and wait for morning. Darius understood this quiet from the time he was 7 years old, the same way he understood the sound of the argument next door, and the way his mother's hand tightened on his shoulder when they walked past certain intersections. What he also understood from about the same age was his mother's voice when she said the sentence that he had been carrying for 43 years like a compass in his chest. He had been 9 years old. He had come home from school with a teacher's note that said he had been difficult, that he had argued with a substitute about a factual error in a textbook that he had refused to back down even when asked to let it go. He remembered being certain he was right, and being more certain that it mattered that he was right, and not understanding why letting it go was the lesson anyone thought he needed to learn. His mother had read the note. She had put it down on the kitchen table. She had looked at him for a long moment with those quick, dark eyes, and then she had said very quietly, "The world will always see your skin before it sees your soul, so you had better make sure your soul is worth seeing." She had not said it unkindly. She had not said it as a warning or a lament. She had said it the way she said everything important, which was simply and directly, and without drama, as a fact about the world that she wanted him to have before the world offered it to him in a less gentle form. He had not fully understood it at 9. By 14, when his best friend from the block was shot over a pair of sneakers on a Tuesday evening, he understood it in a way that settled into his bones and never left. His father, Raymond Cole, was a man of considerable silence, who drove a postal truck for 31 years and never missed a shift, not once, not for weather or illness, or the kind of accumulated exhaustion that breaks most men somewhere in the middle of their working lives. Raymond was a Vietnam veteran who had come back from Southeast Asia with both legs and very few words, and the things he communicated to his son he communicated not through conversation, but through example, which is a slower and more permanent kind of teaching. Raymond showed Darius how to be on time, how to do the thing you said you would do even when it was hard, and especially when no one was checking. How to hold your face still when someone was trying to read what you were thinking. Darius had joined the Calverton Police Department at 23 with a criminal justice degree from Howard University, the first person in his family to graduate from a 4-year university, a fact his mother had framed in the small living room of the Eastwick house and kept there until she died. And a chip on his shoulder that he had learned slowly and painfully to convert into something more useful than anger. The early years had been an education in patience that no classroom could have provided. He had been passed over for assignments that went to men with less experience and lighter skin. He had watched commendations arrive for colleagues whose work he had originated or improved. He had learned to speak in rooms where his voice arrived at a slight discount, where the first thing he said was heard differently than the third thing, where the work of being taken seriously was a full-time second job running underneath the first one. And he had kept going. Not because he was not angry. He was angry often and specifically and with complete justification. But because his mother had told him to make sure his soul was worth seeing, and quitting would have made it less so. Detective at 30. Lieutenant at 37, Deputy Commander at 44, Commander of the entire Calverton District Patrol Division at 49, overseeing 4 precincts, 340 officers, and a command budget that ran to 9 figures. His signature on every patrol assignment in the city, including 14 months ago, the transfer authorization for a lateral hire officer named Wade Pruitt, who had arrived from Harlan County with a file that should have been read more carefully, and a set of habits that had not been acquired by accident. Darius had not read Pruitt's file carefully enough. That was the truth he had been sitting with for 3 weeks, ever since the complaint from Dorothy Crane on Whitmore Lane had crossed his adjutant's desk and been assigned for standard review. He rinsed the sponge in the bucket and watched the soapy water run in pale rivulets down the driveway toward the gutter, carrying the morning's first grime with it, and thought about almost nothing at all. Calverton had been changing for a decade and a half in the way that American cities change when money moves and demographics shift, and the neighborhoods that once had invisible walls around them find the walls becoming more difficult to maintain. Which is to say, slowly at first, and then all at once, with equal amounts of hope and resistance rising on either side of every changed block. Kessler Park was one of those neighborhoods. 30 years ago, it had been the kind of place where the homeowners association sent letters about paint colors, and where the houses had been sold quietly and without legal standing through a network of real estate agents who understood which buyers would receive return calls and which would not. That era had ended legally and eventually socially. And in the past 12 years, a significant number of black professionals had bought homes in Kessler Park, drawn by the school district and the mature trees and the quiet streets, and the fact that they had earned the right to live wherever they chose and intended to exercise it. The adjustment had not been seamless. It rarely was. There had been the homeowners association meetings that ran too long and resolved too little, the neighbors who were friendly, and the neighbors who were coolly correct without ever crossing into warmth. The 311 calls about unfamiliar cars parked on the street that spiked whenever a new family moved in and then declined after a few months when the neighbors ran out of things to report. None of it was by itself a crime. All of it was, in aggregate, a pattern that Darius understood with the precision of a man who had been studying it his entire professional life. The Calverton Police Department, under his command, had been in the middle of a reform process that was genuine, hard-fought, and incomplete, the way all real institutional change is genuine, hard-fought, and incomplete. New use of force protocols that had survived 2 union challenges and 1 city council vote. Mandatory community engagement hours that his officers alternately embraced and resented, depending on their tenure and temperament. A civilian oversight board with actual subpoena power, which was the thing the union had fought hardest and the thing Darius had considered most essential, because oversight without teeth was just observation, and observation without consequence was just documentation of what everyone already knew. There were officers in his division who respected him, without reservation, veterans who had watched him work his way up and understood what it had cost and what it had produced. There were officers who respected him conditionally, in the way that institutional respect sometimes operates, because the rank demanded it, even when the man behind the rank was not the man they would have chosen. And they were officers, fewer now than when he had taken command, who resented him in ways they expressed through the specific grammar of obstruction, through delays in paperwork and creative interpretations of protocol, and the kind of willful misunderstanding that deniability was invented for. He had been dealing with all three kinds for 3 years, and he had learned which problems resolved themselves with time and which ones had to be addressed directly. And he had developed through trial and failure and occasional success a fairly reliable sense of which was which. He had not yet developed a reliable sense of which problems were walking up his own driveway. 3 weeks ago, his adjutant, a meticulous sergeant named Philippa Osei, who filtered his administrative correspondence with the focused attention of someone who understood that the difference between a routine complaint and a structural failure was usually a question of how many similar complaints surrounded it, had flagged a letter from a resident of Whitmore Lane. The resident's name was Dorothy Crane, and she had written to report that a patrol officer had been conducting what she described as unnecessarily aggressive vehicle checks targeting black residents of the neighborhood without apparent legal basis or reasonable cause, on multiple occasions over the past several months. Philippa had attached a note to the complaint that said simply, "Pattern possible. Recommend secondary review before standard processing." Darius had read it, had noted the address, Whitmore Lane, Kessler Park, his own neighborhood, his own street, and had experienced a specific, cold recognition that he had set aside in favor of the protocol he would have applied to any other complaint, which was to assign it for secondary review before escalating to a full investigation. He had not yet received the secondary review. He was washing his car on Whitmore Lane when the patrol cruiser slowed to a stop at the edge of his driveway. And it was not until he stood up and turned around that he realized, with the particular clarity that arrives when several separate pieces of knowledge suddenly arrange themselves into a single coherent picture, that the complaint and the car and the morning and the man getting out of the cruiser were all parts of the same story. He had been reading it from the wrong end. The hose dripped on the concrete. He set the chamois on the car's roof and waited. The driveway itself was a modest geography, wide enough for 2 vehicles parked side by side, with a few feet of breathing room between them. The Camaro on the left, sitting in the good light, and Renata's gray Honda Pilot on the right. Practical and reliable, in the way Renata was practical and reliable, which was a form of love Darius had come to appreciate more deeply than he had at 28 when they had first met at a fundraiser for the Georgetown Criminal Justice Clinic, and argued for 45 minutes about mandatory minimum sentencing before either of them thought to exchange names. The house behind the driveway was a colonial, with dark green shutters and a wide front porch where 2 wooden rocking chairs sat at an angle to each other that suggested they were intended for conversation, and in fact Darius and Renata did use them for conversation on summer evenings, when the neighborhood quieted down and the fireflies came up from the lawn, and it was possible to talk without the ambient noise of the world interrupting. They had bought this house 8 years ago, after 3 years of looking, and the day they had signed the closing documents, Darius had sat in the car in the parking lot of the title company for 4 minutes without moving. Not from any emotion he could name precisely, but from the particular sensation of arriving somewhere that a 9-year-old boy from Eastwick had been told directly and indirectly and in 100 different ways that he was not supposed to arrive. Through the kitchen window, visible from the driveway, in the way that all kitchen windows are visible from driveways on weekend mornings, Renata moved past the glass with her coffee mug in her left hand and her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head in the position she wore them when she was not reading but not ready to put them down, which was most of Saturday morning. She did not look out the window when she passed. She was thinking about something which was where Renata spent most of her interior life, thinking carefully and completely about one thing at a time. A quality Darius had always admired and occasionally envied. From the open garage came the sound of the radio Darius had left on when he started, an old soul station that played without interruption. No commercials, no commentary, just the music. And right now it was Marvin Gaye, the particular Marvin Gaye of the early 70s, the songs that sounded like they were made from equal parts tenderness and exhaustion, which was also a description of certain marriages and certain careers and certain Saturday mornings in October. Dorothy Crane across the street was not yet visible on her porch, but her dog, a large, slow-moving golden retriever named, according to the collar tag, Darius had read one morning when the dog wandered briefly into his driveway. Francis had been on his morning walk already. The leash trail left in the dew of the front lawn, visible from where Darius stood. Dorothy was 68 years old, a retired school principal who had lived on Whitmore Lane for 22 years, and who had the particular quality of long-term residence on quiet streets, which was that she noticed everything without appearing to notice anything. That she could reconstruct the day's events on the block from the position of a trash can, or the presence of an unfamiliar car, with the accuracy of a detective and the discretion of a confessor. She was the longest-tenured resident on the block. She had watched the neighborhood change and had decided, without apparent drama or resistance, that change was what neighborhoods did, and that her job was to know it well enough to protect what mattered in it. Darius had been washing the Camaro for 45 minutes by the time the patrol cruiser stopped at the edge of his driveway, and he was in the final stage of the work. The detail passed the part where he moved from the broad panels to the chrome and the rims, and the small specific places where the dirt hid when you weren't paying close enough attention. He was crouched beside the rear driver's side wheel well, with a soft bristle brush working the inner lip of the rim, when he heard it. Not the siren, not the lights. Just the engine dropping to a lower idle and then going quiet. He finished the section of rim he was working on. He set the brush in the bucket. He straightened up slowly, his knees sending their usual morning complaint up through his thighs and into his lower back. And he turned around, drying his hands on the front of the old Howard t-shirt, and looked at the patrol cruiser sitting at the edge of his property, with its engine off and its light bar dark, and the driver's door beginning to swing open. He had been a police officer for 28 years. He knew what was coming before it arrived. Wade Pruitt had been in Calverton for 14 months, and had spent the majority of that time in a state of low-grade outrage that he would have described, if asked, as frustration with a department that had forgotten what policing was supposed to look like. He was 31 years old, lean in the way of men who stay thin not from discipline, but from metabolism, and the kind of restless energy that needs somewhere to go, with a reddish complexion that caught the light in a way that made him look, depending on the circumstances, either boyish or flushed with anger. And the difference between the two was often a matter of whether you had recently done something that he had decided was wrong. His pale blue eyes had a narrowing reflex, rather than a widening one, meaning that when he was surprised or confused, they contracted rather than opened, converting uncertainty into a look that could be read as either suspicion or challenge, and which was usually both. He had grown up in Harlan County, 3 hours south of Calverton, in a town called Ridley Mills, where his father had been a county deputy for 22 years, and where the understanding of what law enforcement meant had been transmitted to Wade not through formal instruction, but through proximity and observation, the way children learn the things that shape them most permanently. His father was not a cruel man, in the way that cruelty is understood when it announces itself. He was a man who operated within a framework so settled and so old that it had become invisible to the people inside it. A framework in which certain things were simply understood without needing to be said. Among them, who the rules were for and who the rules were about, and what the difference between those two categories looked like when it walked down the street. Wade had absorbed this framework the way water absorbs color completely and without apparent effort, and by the time he was old enough to examine it, he was already inside it, too deeply to see its edges. He had joined the Harlan County Sheriff's Department at 22 without deliberating over the choice for very long, because it was the obvious next step in a life where certain steps were obvious, and others were not considered, and he had spent 4 years there developing what he called his instincts, and what 3 formal complaints called excessive force, each one filed by a resident of color. Each one worked through the county's complaint process and resolved in his favor through a combination of departmental loyalty, union support, and the specific institutional gravity that pulls investigations toward conclusions that require the least amount of change. The complaints had not changed his behavior. They had confirmed his understanding of how the system worked, which was that it worked for him. And the confirmation had settled into him like a foundation being poured. His transfer to Calverton had been presented to him as an opportunity: larger department, more resources, faster advancement track. And he had taken it, without understanding that the city he was moving to operated under a completely different set of expectations, enforced by a commander whose approach to the job was built on a philosophy that Wade had never encountered in any form that he had been willing to take seriously. The first 6 months in Calverton had been a continuous and low-grade shock. The body camera compliance protocols were not optional, as they had been in practice in Harlan County, but actively enforced with consequences. The de-escalation requirements that appeared in the policy manual were not treated as idealistic suggestions, but as binding professional standards. The community engagement hours, time spent in the precinct's assigned neighborhoods without a specific enforcement purpose, simply being present and approachable, had felt to Wade like the most profound waste of police resources he had ever witnessed, like sending carpenters to a hospital to watch people recover. He had complained about all of it to anyone who would listen, with the specific certainty of a man who was completely confident in his own perspective and had not yet encountered a version of events that challenged it. He had complained about the commander whose name he pronounced with a particular flatness that communicated everything his words carefully avoided. He had seen a photograph of Commander Darius Cole in the district newsletter, the kind of posed command portrait that went up on bulletin boards in every precinct, and had filed it without comment in the category of things he had already decided about. He had never met Darius Cole in person. This was not unusual for an officer of his rank in a division of 340 people. It had also not struck him as a gap worth closing. This Saturday morning he was 3 hours into a patrol shift in Kessler Park, a neighborhood he had specifically requested through the watch assignment process, because he had developed over the past several months a conviction that the neighborhood was being used for what exactly he kept deliberately vague, even in his own thinking, in ways that required more aggressive patrol attention than it was currently receiving. 3 auto thefts in the neighborhood 6 months ago, all solved the perpetrators from outside the district, had provided him with a framework of justification that he was still drawing from long after the specific incidents had been closed. He was looking, in other words, for something to find. He turned onto Whitmore Lane at 7:49 in the morning, the autumn light coming in low and orange through the oak trees, the street quiet and still, and his eyes moved up the block in the practiced scanning way of a man who had decided before he left the precinct that morning that he was going to make something happen today. He slowed the cruiser. He saw the car first, the midnight black Camaro parked on the driveway, impossibly clean for a neighborhood car on a weekend morning. And then he saw the man beside it, and in the 4 seconds it took his brain to construct a narrative from what his eyes delivered, he had already arrived at the conclusion and was simply looking for the details to support it. In the passenger seat, Officer Jesse Albright had been watching the neighborhood with the particular vigilance of a junior officer who was simultaneously trying to observe everything and be seen observing nothing, which is the particular exhausting tightrope walk of 6 months partnered with Wade Pruitt. Jesse was 24 years old, black, the son of a high school football coach from Richmond, who had taught him the same essential lesson from 2 different directions, his entire childhood: that the world would test you, and the only variable you controlled was how you showed up to be tested. And he had come out of the Calverton Police Academy 8 months ago with genuine idealism, the kind that arrives intact and gets tested almost immediately, and either survives in some amended form or doesn't survive at all. 6 months with Pruitt had tested it severely. He had watched Pruitt initiate stops that had no legal foundation, and articulate justifications for them afterward that were technically coherent, but factually empty. He had watched him use a tone with certain residents that he did not use with others, a tone that communicated clearly what the legal language of the stop carefully avoided. He had watched him tighten handcuffs in ways that were not necessary, and pat down individuals in ways that were not proportionate. And each time, Jesse had felt the specific, suffocating pressure of the culture he had been warned about in the academy, and had not fully understood until he was inside it. The understanding that speaking up had costs that fell on you, and not on the person you spoke up about. That the blue wall was not a metaphor, but a physical reality made of daily professional interactions and shared meals, and the simple social pressure of needing the people around you to have your back. He had told himself he was being patient. He had told himself he was surviving the probationary period. He had told himself that he would transfer to a different unit and become the kind of officer he had planned to be. And he had almost believed it, often enough to keep going. But he had also quietly and without telling anyone started keeping notes. The notepad on the dashboard of the cruiser had a different function than the official one. The official notepad was for traffic stops and incident notes and the routine documentation of patrol work. The second notepad, the one he kept in his breast pocket and transferred to fresh pages every 2 weeks, was a detailed record of every stop he had witnessed that had no legal basis he could identify, with dates and times and locations and the specific words Pruitt had used and the words the stopped individuals had used in return. He had been keeping this record for 4 months. He had not decided yet what to do with it. He had simply decided that if something happened, the record would exist. Now he watched Pruitt slow the cruiser as they turned onto Whitmore Lane, and he watched his training officer's eyes fix on the driveway with the particular quality of focus that Jesse had learned to recognize as the prelude to something going wrong. And he felt the familiar dread settle into his stomach like cold water. The man crouching beside the rear wheel of the Camaro was black, wearing casual clothes, doing nothing that Jesse could identify as suspicious from the moving vehicle. The car was clean and beautiful, and parked on a private residential driveway. The morning was quiet. There was no call on the radio, no flag in the MDT, no civilian report or request for service that had brought them to this specific address. There was only Pruitt's gaze narrowing as the cruiser slowed, his jaw setting into the particular configuration that meant he had already decided something and was moving toward it. Jesse felt the words forming in his chest. "We don't have a reason to stop." But the words had not made it to his mouth. The last 11 times either, and the cost of saying them was always the same. A long, contemptuous look, a dismissal, and then the rest of the shift conducted in the specific silence that Pruitt used as punishment for disagreement. Pruitt put the cruiser in park. Jesse reached for the official notepad on the dashboard, which was where his hand always went when something was starting, because documentation was the only thing he had found that felt like action without being action. And then he stopped, reached instead into his breast pocket, and took out the other notepad. He clicked his pen. He wrote the time, 7:49 a.m. He wrote the location, Whitmore Lane Residential. He wrote, "Cruiser stopped without call or observed violation. Subject, black male, adult, private driveway, washing vehicle." He wrote, "No probable cause observed." He did not write what he was feeling, which was dread and recognition and the specific grinding shame of a man who was watching something wrong happen and was not yet able to make himself stop it. The cruiser door opened on the driver's side, and Pruitt stepped out, and Jesse watched him cross to the front of the vehicle and stand there for a moment with his hands on his hips, surveying the driveway the way a man surveys territory he has decided is his. And Jesse made a decision. It was not the decision he wanted to make, which was to get out of the car and stand beside Pruitt and say clearly and on the record that there was no legal basis for this stop and that they needed to get back in the cruiser and leave. He knew what that decision would cost him, and the honest truth was that at 6 months into his career in a department he was still learning, with a union period that protected Pruitt more than it protected him, he was not yet able to pay that cost. He had enough self-awareness to know that this was not courage, but fear, and that calling it strategy was a way of making the fear more comfortable to live with. But there was another decision available, and he made it. He reached into his breast pocket and took out his personal cell phone, not the department-issued device, his own phone, and he balanced it on the edge of the seat with the camera facing out the passenger window at an angle that would capture the driveway, and he pressed record. He then picked up the second notepad and continued writing. He wrote Pruitt's body language as he approached the man at the driveway right hand, near duty belt, aggressive stance, no greeting. He wrote the man's posture as he stood, hands visible, no sudden movement, turned slowly. He wrote, subject appears calm, no visible threat, no aggressive behavior. He kept writing as Pruitt reached the edge of the driveway and stopped. And he kept writing as the man turned around from the car. And he kept writing as the first words were exchanged at a distance too great for Jesse to hear them clearly, though he could hear the tone of Pruitt's voice from inside the cruiser, the specific proprietary tone that Jesse had heard 11 times before, the tone that said, "Explain yourself to me," without any legal foundation for the demand. And then he noticed something that made him stop writing for a moment. The man at the driveway was not responding to Pruitt's tone the way people usually responded to it. Usually, there was a visible recalibration, a slight shrinking, an instinctive move toward compliance, motivated by the presence of the uniform and the authority it implied, even when the authority was being exercised illegally. Jesse had watched it happen 11 times, and every time it had confirmed Pruitt's confidence in the method, which was the exact mechanism by which bad habits in policing sustained themselves. They worked, which convinced the person using them that they were right. The man at the driveway was not shrinking. He was standing with his hands loose at his sides and his posture completely unaltered, looking at Pruitt with a quality of attention that Jesse would later struggle to describe accurately, but which he eventually captured in the notes he filed as, subject appeared entirely calm, no anxiety response visible. Seems to be listening rather than reacting. It was the stillness Jesse would later tell the internal affairs investigator. The man on the driveway had the stillness of someone who had faced much harder things than what was in front of him right now, and who was waiting rather than fearing, which was a completely different thing, and which Jesse recognized, because his father had that same quality on the sideline during a game that wasn't going well. Not panic, not passivity, but the deliberate stillness of a man conserving something he was going to need later. Jesse pressed record again to make sure it was still running. He wrote, 7:51 a.m. Contact initiated. Subject non-threatening. Monitoring. Outside the window, Pruitt took a step closer to the man on the driveway, and his right hand moved from his hip to a position closer to his duty belt. Jesse kept writing. Darius registered Pruitt's approach the way he had been trained to register approaching figures in 100 different contexts over 28 years. Not with alarm, because alarm was a reactive state that closed options, but with the specific, wide-awake attention that opened them, taking in everything at once. The right hand near the duty belt, the wide planted stance of a man who had decided before he arrived that he was in charge of whatever was about to happen. The jaw set into a configuration that Darius had written about in 5 separate disciplinary reports over the past 3 years, under the heading, Posture Indicating Predetermination of Use of Force. He had trained cadets to recognize this posture as a warning sign when they encountered it in the field. He was now observing it from the field, from the subject's side of the interaction, which had a quality of clarity that he had not anticipated and would find himself returning to in the weeks that followed. He kept his hands loose at his sides, visible, unhurried. He turned from the car slowly, not quickly, letting the turn be as unthreatening as a turn could be, and he looked at the officer approaching across his driveway. And he felt something cold and precise settle into his chest. Not fear. Fear was not the right word. Or rather, it was one of several things happening simultaneously, and it was not the dominant one. But something more like recognition. the recognition of a specific species of danger that he had been studying his entire professional life, and that had never been this close to him in this form before. Pruitt did not offer a greeting. He stopped at the edge of the driveway, his feet planted, and he looked at Darius the way certain officers looked at certain citizens, with a prior assessment already completed and a narrative already written. And he said, "What are you doing out here?" Not, "Good morning." Not, "Is everything okay?" Not any of the 12 opening phrases the department's community engagement protocol listed as best practices for initial resident contact. Just, "What are you doing out here?" Darius heard the subtext in the question as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, because after 52 years, the subtext of that particular question had never once been ambiguous to him. And he answered it calmly and directly, washing his car, which was what it appeared he was doing in his driveway, which was where he lived. Pruitt asked who the car belongs to. Darius said it belonged to him. Pruitt's eyes moved across the Camaro with the specific calculation of a man deciding whether to believe something that his preconceptions made difficult to accept. And then he asked for identification, without explaining why, without citing any legal basis for the request, without stating what crime he believed was being or had been committed, all three of which were required by the department's Stop and Identify protocol, before a request for identification carried any legal weight. And here is where the morning turned on its axis, quietly and entirely, though Pruitt did not feel the turn, and would not feel it until much later. Darius reached for his wallet, and as his hand moved toward his back pocket, he thought of Dorothy Crane's complaint, the one that had crossed his adjutant's desk 3 weeks ago and been assigned for review. And he thought of the language of that complaint. Unnecessarily aggressive vehicle checks targeting black residents of the neighborhood without apparent legal basis or reasonable cause. He thought of the residents who had been stopped on this street before him, residents who had not had the option he had right now in his back pocket. Residents who had produced their licenses and answered the questions and gone home afterward with the particular diminishment that comes from being treated as a suspect in your own neighborhood. A diminishment that has a weight and a duration that people who have not experienced it tend to underestimate significantly. He thought of the young officers in his division who learned how to police by watching senior officers police, who absorbed the methods they observed the way his mother had told him the world absorbed its judgments about him, before being taught simply by watching what happened and who it happened to. He thought of everything that would not change if he produced his command credentials right now and watched Pruitt go pale and retreat to the cruiser without a record of what had occurred here, without a document, without a completed action that bore his signature and his badge number and would follow him through every subsequent investigation. He produced his driver's license. Nothing else. He handed it to Pruitt and watched the officer read the name Darius Ellington Cole and watched the name mean nothing to him, which was the point, which was precisely and specifically the point, because that was what it meant for every other resident of this street who handed over a license with their name on it and watched it mean nothing, and then had to live with the consequences of that nothingness. Today the name was going to mean something. Not yet, but soon. Make sure your soul is worth seeing, his mother had told him. And he had spent 43 years trying. And this morning, the trying looked like standing on his own driveway, in a worn-out T-shirt, and letting a man with a badge and a prior assessment work his way to the end of his rope, with the patient, quiet certainty of someone who already knew where the rope ended. He kept his hands visible. He waited. Pruitt used Darius's first name within the first 30 seconds of reading the license, which was not an accident, and was not casual, and was not the way officers were trained to address members of the public in any protocol that bore the Calverton PD's name. Because using a citizen's first name in the context of a stop was a specific and well-understood power move designed to establish a hierarchy without stating one, to put the person being addressed in the position of a subordinate rather than a rights-bearing individual whose cooperation was requested rather than commanded. So Darius, with the particular flatness that turned the name into a diminishment, "What exactly are you doing out here this early?" The question was the same question he had already answered, which was the first iteration of a technique Darius had documented in officers under his command, and in the training materials he had helped develop, asking the same question repeatedly, with escalating implied skepticism, creating pressure for the subject to expand or alter their answer in ways that could then be used as inconsistency. It was a technique that worked exceptionally well on people who were nervous or uncertain, or who lacked the knowledge that they were under no obligation to keep talking. Darius answered the question the same way he had answered it the first time, calmly and completely, and then he waited. Pruitt asked about the bucket. He asked about the brushes laid out on the driveway edge. He asked whether the car had a current registration sticker, glancing at the rear plate with the performed skepticism of a man who knew what he was looking for and had already decided he would find it. And when the sticker was current and properly affixed, he spent a moment looking at it that was slightly longer than necessary before moving on. He asked whether Darius had any prior history of vehicle theft, which was a question with no legal basis whatsoever in the context of a stop and identify interaction, a question that existed only to plant a category in the subject's mind to make them feel accused before any accusation had been formally made. And Darius answered it the way he answered everything that morning, directly, and without rising to the implication, which was the answer the technique was not designed for, and which therefore produced in Pruitt a visible frustration that manifested as a slight tightening around the eyes and a shift of weight from one foot to the other. "Step away from the car," Pruitt said. He gave no legal basis. He did not say why. He said it the way orders are given when the person giving them believes the uniform provides its own justification, which it does not. And Darius asked quietly which crime he was suspected of committing. Across the street, Dorothy Crane's front door opened. She had been watching from inside since the cruiser stopped the moment an unfamiliar patrol car had slowed on her block. Because she had been watching this street for 22 years, and she had a particular sensitivity developed through observation rather than theory to the difference between a cruiser doing a routine pass and a cruiser that had stopped for a reason she was going to want a record of. She stepped out onto her porch with her morning coffee, and then she went back inside, and she came back out with her tablet. In the patrol cruiser, Jesse Albright watched the front door of the house across the street and watched the woman come out and go back in and come back out with a device in her hand. And he felt something loosen very slightly in the knot of dread in his stomach, not because the device changed anything about what was happening in the driveway, but because it meant that whatever happened next was going to be seen by more than one set of eyes, and witnessed things and unwitnessed things had different weights in the institutional processes that followed them. He adjusted the angle of his phone on the seat slightly. He kept writing. On the driveway, Pruitt had answered Darius's question about what crime he was suspected of, with a recitation of the auto theft reports from 6 months ago. 3 incidents all solved, all involving perpetrators from outside the district. And Darius had listened to the recitation with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was cataloging it precisely, and had said, still quietly, that the fact of solved historical theft reports in the general area did not constitute reasonable articulable suspicion that he specifically had committed a crime, which was the legal standard required for a detainment stop. Pruitt heard this as defiance rather than law. His complexion had been moving toward its angrier register for the past 3 minutes, the reddish flush climbing up from his collar in the way it did when something was not going the way he had planned for it to go. And now it had reached the level that his fellow officers at Harlan County had called the signal, the visible indication that Pruitt had passed the point where talking was going to resolve anything, and had entered the territory where he was going to do something physical, whether or not there was a reason to. His right hand moved from the near position to a resting position on his duty belt. The morning was still quiet. The mockingbird had gone silent. The sound was small and precise and entirely deliberate. The snap of the retention strap on Pruitt's holster releasing, and in the context of an October morning on a residential street with a compliant, stationary man standing 3 feet away from him, with his hands visible at his sides. The sound was not a safety precaution, and was not a professional reflex, and was not any of the things the policy manual described as appropriate grounds for removing a weapon from secured carry. It was a threat. Darius had heard that sound hundreds of times in his career, in contexts ranging from legitimate tactical situations to training exercises, to the specific disciplinary conversations he had conducted as a commander with officers who had used it inappropriately. And he knew it as well as he knew his own name. And he knew, in the moment it occurred, that he was looking at a man who had made a choice to escalate without legal basis, which was the kind of choice that generated consequences that could not be walked back. He looked at Pruitt's hand. He looked at Pruitt's face. And he said in the same level voice he had been using for everything that morning that the officer had just made a physical threat gesture toward a compliant citizen on private property, that this moment was observable from multiple vantage points, and that he was asking the officer for the last time to reconsider what he was doing before he did anything further. Pruitt heard this as the worst possible version of what it was, which was a challenge. And a man who has converted all his professional experience into the belief that he is unchallengeable receives a challenge as a violence. He grabbed Darius by the arm. Darius went completely limp. It was a deliberate choice, made in the fraction of a second between the grab and the response. A choice informed by 28 years of training and 3 decades of understanding the specific physics of these encounters, which is that the easiest thing to do and the most dangerous thing to do, and the thing that most undermines your own position afterward, is to resist physically. And the hardest thing to do, and the most protective thing to do, and the thing that puts the full weight of the encounter onto the person initiating it, is to offer no physical resistance whatsoever. To become a completely passive presence that must be acted upon, rather than a force that can be reacted to. And he announced it loudly and clearly, the way he had been trained to announce it, and the way he had trained his officers to listen for it, as the indication that an encounter was being documented for future accountability. I am not resisting. I am compliant. I am being detained without legal basis, and I am not resisting. Across the street, Dorothy Crane raised her tablet. In the cruiser, Jesse Albright did not look away from the driveway. Pruitt's grip on Darius's arm tightened, and he pulled him away from the Camaro toward the edge of the driveway, and Darius moved with the pull, not against it. And he kept his hands loose and visible, and he kept the announcement audible. I'm compliant. I am not resisting. And from inside the open garage, the Marvin Gaye was still playing What's Going On, drifting out across the driveway and the morning. And the particular quality of that song in that moment, its combination of tenderness and exhaustion, and the specific aching question of its title, had an irony that Darius registered somewhere below the level of conscious thought, and filed away with everything else he was filing away. Jesse Albright had stopped writing in the notepad, and had picked up his personal phone in both hands, steadying it. His hands were not entirely steady. He steadied them anyway. There was a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, the specific suspended duration of a decision being made by a man who had not yet committed fully to the thing he was about to do, where the morning held still, and Pruitt had not yet reached for the handcuffs, and Darius had not yet said the thing he was about to say. And in those 3 or 4 seconds, the encounter could still have resolved itself in any number of ways that did not involve what came next. Darius used those seconds. He said it quietly, which was the right way to say things that needed to be heard rather than reacted to. And he said it in the voice that Renata had once told him late one evening on the porch after a long day was his most authoritative voice, precisely because it was his quietest. The voice of a man who did not need volume because he had already decided he was right and was simply waiting for the room to understand it. He said, "Officer, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to step back from this driveway. Because after today, every single thing that happens to you is going to be the direct result of the choice you are making right now in the next 10 seconds. And I want you to understand that before you make it. Pruitt reached for his handcuffs. The ratcheting sound of steel cuffs being removed from their case was one of the most specific sounds in Darius's professional experience, a sound he had associated for 28 years with the formal conclusion of an encounter, the moment when the legal weight shifted fully from the officer's justification to the subject's rights. And he heard it now on his own driveway, with a clarity that was almost meditative. He turned around. He placed his hands behind his back. He felt the metal close around his left wrist, then his right, and he felt the deliberate extra notch, the petty vindictive tightening that certain officers used, and that left marks visible under fluorescent lights and documented in IA photographs. And he said nothing about the extra notch because he did not need to say anything about the extra notch, because Dorothy Crane's tablet was recording the angle of his wrists, and Jesse Albright's phone was recording the sound of the ratchet, and Pruitt's own body camera was recording everything that Pruitt's body camera was currently pointed at. Darius was walked toward the cruiser. As he passed the open garage, the music was still playing. The Isley Brothers, now something about needing to find a way. The melody, gentle and slightly mournful in the morning air. And he thought with a precision that surprised him about his mother's hands, the antiseptic smell of them, the way they had felt when she put them on his shoulders when he was 9 years old, and told him something he was still carrying. He thought, I am making sure my soul is worth seeing. He ducked his head at the cruiser door and got in the plastic back seat, hard and airless, and smelling of institutional cleaner, the metal grate between him and Pruitt's seat, dividing the car into two different worlds. Jesse Albright slid into the passenger seat and did not look back. His notepad was in his left hand. His phone was in his breast pocket, and it was still recording. The cruiser pulled out of Whitmore Lane, and the Camaro sat in the driveway under the morning sun, with the passenger door still open and the hose still dripping onto the concrete. And across the street, Dorothy Crane stood on her porch with her tablet and watched the cruiser until it turned the corner at the end of the block and disappeared. And then she went inside and sent an email to the address that was listed on the Calverton Police Department's official website under the heading Commander's Office Direct Contact. She included the video, the whole thing, all 16 minutes of it. The back of a patrol cruiser is designed to be uncomfortable in ways that are both deliberate and functional. The hard plastic seat and the lack of interior door handles and the plexiglass divider, all communicating the same institutional message, which is that you are here because you have been placed here, and you will remain here until someone with authority decides otherwise. And the design does its work on most people most of the time, producing either submission or anger, both of which are useful to the officer in the front seat, for different reasons. Darius sat in the back with his cuffed hands pressing into the seat behind him, and looked at the back of Wade Pruitt's head through the smudged plexiglass, and did what he had trained himself to do in every high-pressure situation he had faced in 28 years, which was to convert the available sensory information into a precise, sequential, retrievable record. Badge number visible on Pruitt's chest before the cuffs went on, 2247. Cruiser number 44, visible on the door panel before he ducked into the back seat. Time of initial contact, approximately 7:49 a.m., confirmed by Jesse Albright's notepad, which Darius had seen him writing in. Officer in the passenger seat, Jesse Albright, nameplate, confirmed. Badge number, not captured, to be determined from the duty roster. Departure time from Whitmore Lane, approximately 8:03 a.m., based on elapsed time since contact. He ran through the sequence twice, committing it to the specific kind of memory he had developed for testimony preparation. The memory that did not embellish and did not compress, and did not allow the narrative weight of an event to reshape the factual record of it. Because the factual record was what mattered when the institutional processes began. And the institutional processes were going to begin very soon. Pruitt was talking from the front seat, a running monologue directed partly at the rearview mirror and partly at Jesse, who was looking straight ahead, with the specific vacancy of a person maintaining a carefully blank expression over something that was neither blank nor vacant. And the monologue had the particular quality of a man talking himself into the confidence he was not entirely feeling, reassuring himself, through the act of narration, that he had done the right thing and would be supported in having done it, and that the man in the back seat was exactly what he appeared to be, and nothing more. Darius listened to the monologue and did not respond to it, because responding served no purpose, and because he was busy doing something else, which was thinking about his mother. Not about the arrest, not about Pruitt, not about the sequence of institutional events that was going to unfold in the next several hours with the inevitability of something set in motion rather than something chosen. He was thinking about Gloria Cole, who had told him at 9 years old to make sure his soul was worth seeing, who had gone to work 6 days a week for 23 years, smelling of antiseptic soap, who had framed his diploma in the living room in Eastwick and kept it on the wall until she died, who had never once told him that what he was trying to do was not possible, only that it required a certain quality of soul to sustain. He thought about her hands. He thought, I'm going to let this play all the way out. He thought she would have understood exactly why. Jesse Albright had not looked back once since getting in the car, but Darius noticed in the passenger side mirror that Jesse's left hand was resting in his lap at an angle that suggested it was holding something, and the something it was holding was approximately the size and shape of a cell phone. The cruiser turned off the main road and headed toward the District 3 station house, and Darius leaned his head back against the hard plastic and closed his eyes and let the rocking of the vehicle carry him forward toward whatever came next. The District 3 station house was a building Darius knew the way you know any building you have moved through hundreds of times in a professional capacity. Not emotionally, but spatially. The layout carried in muscle memory. The specific dimensions of the rooms indexed without effort. The sight lines and camera positions, and the location of the duty officer's desk relative to the holding area, all present in his mind. The way useful things are present when you have needed them many times in different ways. He had always entered through the front door in uniform, with a visitor's badge or a command credential clipped to his chest, and people had made way for him in the hallways, and the coffee had appeared without being requested, and the conversations in the bullpen had adjusted their register when he walked through, not from fear exactly, but from the specific awareness of rank that changes the social temperature of a room without anyone naming the change. He entered through the sally port in a faded Howard University t-shirt and athletic shorts, with his hands behind his back. The booking sergeant was Owen Haley, 58 years old, a man who had been behind this particular desk for 19 years, and who had developed through the sustained observation of a sample size that most researchers could not replicate, a finely calibrated radar for the subset of bookings that were going to become problems. He had seen every variety of guilty and innocent, and both simultaneously every variety of composed and terrified and beyond caring. And he had learned to read the air around a situation before he read the paperwork, which was why he looked up from his monitor when Pruitt marched Darius in before Pruitt said a word. Pruitt announced the charges with the casual confidence of a man who had done this before and expected the machine to receive his input and process it without friction. Suspicion of vehicle theft, failure to identify obstruction, 3 charges, none of which would survive 5 minutes of scrutiny against the actual events of the morning, which was not Haley's determination to make at the booking desk, but which was the kind of thing that 19 years of observation made visible, even without a full record. Haley asked for the ID. Pruitt handed it across. Haley read the name Darius Ellington Cole and typed it into his terminal with the 2-fingered efficiency of a man who types not for speed, but for accuracy. And the system took 4 seconds to return a result, which was the standard response time. And then the result appeared on his screen. The result was not standard. The screen showed Calverton, PD, internal direct description. Cole, Darius E. Commander, District Patrol Division Commanding Officer, all precincts, priority contact. Owen Haley sat very still. He looked at the screen. He looked up at the man standing at his counter in a worn t-shirt and athletic shorts, hands coming forward now as Pruitt removed the cuffs without being asked, the red marks on the wrists visible under the fluorescent lights. The man looked back at him. He did not say anything. He did not have to say anything. He simply met Haley's eyes with the specific quality of waiting that belongs to a person who has just confirmed that the person in front of them has understood something important. And then he gave one small, deliberate nod. Yes, the nod said, "That is exactly who I am." Haley looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was at the side desk, his back turned, already starting on his arrest report, humming something low under his breath, with the slightly elevated energy of a man who had concluded a successful operation and was already composing the account of it in his head. Haley looked at Jesse Albright, who was standing near the door to the bullpen, his notepad in one hand and his other hand in his breast pocket, his eyes on the floor. His expression that of a man who was bearing a weight he had been carrying for some time, and was not sure how much longer he could carry it. Haley made a decision in the time it took him to set down his pen, which was not a long time, but was enough time to consider the available options and understand which one was correct. He did not call across the booking area. He did not alert Pruitt. He did not flag the discrepancy in the standard way that would have produced a scene in the bullpen before Pruitt had finished writing a single line of his report. Instead, he asked Pruitt, without turning from his screen, to take Miles, he used the name on the ID, not the title, not yet, to the property processing area at the end of the hall, while Haley completed the intake paperwork, which was a routine instruction that required no explanation and produced no alarm in Pruitt, who gestured at Darius with the casual, proprietary authority of a man who expected to be obeyed and had not yet encountered a reason to doubt it. Down the hallway, in the small property processing room, with its plastic chair and its single overhead light and its laminate table, Haley came in 2 minutes later, with a cup of water and a telephone, and set both on the table in front of Darius. He said very quietly, "Sir, I need you to make the call you need to make. And I need you to know that I'm going to go back to that desk and finish the intake without alerting the arresting officer. And I need you to tell me if there is anything else I should be doing right now." Darius picked up the cup of water. He drank half of it. He said, "You're doing exactly the right thing, Sergeant. Keep the intake moving. I need him to finish that report." He reached for the telephone. He dialed a number he had memorized 3 years ago when he took command, and had hoped he would never need to use before business hours. The line rang twice. Deputy Chief Leonard Marsh answered on the second ring with the alert, slightly wary tone of a man who has been in senior law enforcement long enough to know that calls on secure lines at unusual hours are never good news, and that the speed of his response to them is the only variable he controls. Darius identified himself and said where he was. The silence on the other end of the line was approximately 4 seconds long, which was the time it took a man of Leonard Marsh's experience and intelligence to convert the information he had just received into a preliminary understanding of its implications, which were considerable, and were multiplying by the second. Then Marsh began asking questions, and Darius answered them in the same sequence and with the same level voice he used in command briefings: the officer's name and badge number, the cruiser designation, the time of initial contact, the address where the stop occurred, the charges being booked, the name of the booking sergeant who was currently managing the situation with appropriate discretion. When he finished, Marsh said, "Are you hurt?" Darius said, "Wrists are marked from the cuffs. Nothing that requires medical attention." Marsh said, "I'm on my way." Darius said, "Not yet." Another silence, shorter this time. The silence of a man who was about to argue. It was deciding whether arguing was the right choice. Darius explained what he needed, which was not extraction and was not quiet resolution, and was not the kind of institutional response that left the record incomplete and allowed the behavior to continue under the protection of a handled situation. Because a handled situation was exactly what the 3 complaints buried at the supervisory level over the past 14 months had been. And handled situations had a way of producing the same outcomes repeatedly, until someone was willing to let them play out instead. He needed 2 things before Marsh arrived at District 3. The first, no contact with the desk sergeant or the booking area, no alert to the officers on the floor, no disruption to the arrest report currently being completed by Officer Wade Pruitt under his own name and badge number, and therefore under penalty of perjury, because a completed signed arrest report that contradicted the body camera footage and the civilian tablet footage and Jesse Albright's written notes and Darius's own command testimony was a prosecutorial foundation that no union lawyer could dismantle in arbitration. The second, a body camera evidence hold immediately on all footage from Cruiser 44 for the past 90 days, not just today's footage, the full 90 days, placed through the department's evidence unit. Before Pruitt had any indication that the hold had been requested, Marsh wrote both instructions down. Darius could hear the pen against the paper and understood that Marsh was not the kind of man who assumed he would remember things that needed to be remembered. Then Darius said, "Bring Carla Brixton." Marsh said, "IA." Darius said, "I want this done right." A pause. "Yes, sir." Darius said, "And when you come in, Leonard, come in the front. Uniform." "Understood. 1 hour. Less." Darius hung up the phone and sat in the property processing room with a plastic chair and the laminate table and the half-finished cup of water. And he let himself be still for a moment, which was something he almost never allowed himself during a situation in motion, because stillness during motion was a luxury that situations in motion did not usually offer. He thought about the Camaro sitting in the driveway on Whitmore Lane, with the passenger door open and the hose dripping on the concrete. And he thought about Renata, moving past the kitchen window with her coffee and her reading glasses on top of her head. And he thought about what she was going to say when he called her, which he was going to do in a few minutes, after he had let himself be still for one more moment. He thought about Pruitt in the bullpen right now, filling in the boxes of his arrest report with the practiced language of an officer who believed he was writing a document that would serve him. And he thought about the specific, particular nature of the trap that was closing around a man who did not know it was closing, the way traps always work best, when the person inside them believes they are in charge of the situation. He thought about Dorothy Crane's complaint and the 3 weeks it had sat in a review queue, and the way things that sit in queues accumulate a cost that someone eventually has to pay. He thought about Jesse Albright's face in the moment the cruiser stopped at the edge of the driveway, the dread visible in his posture, even from where Darius had been standing. And he thought about the notepad Jesse had been writing in, with the focused attention of a young officer who did not yet know what to do with what he was seeing, but had decided that writing it down was the beginning of doing something. He thought about his mother's hands. He thought, "The world will see your skin before it sees your soul." He thought, "I've been making sure my soul is worth seeing for 43 years, and this morning, I'm going to let it speak for itself, in the record, in the report, in the footage, in every document and piece of evidence that comes out of this station house today." He reached for the phone again and dialed Renata. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been awake long enough to be past the first cup of coffee and into the second. And when she heard his voice, she said before he said anything, "Where are you?" He told her. She was quiet for exactly the amount of time that the information required. Then she said, "Are you safe?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." And then she said, "I'm going to go close the garage and turn off the hose." He almost smiled. He said, "Thank you, Renata." She said, "Be careful, Darius." He said, "Always." In the bullpen of the District 3 station house, 40 feet and a closed door away from the room where his commanding officer was sitting with a cup of water and a telephone, Officer Wade Pruitt was constructing the written record of the morning's events, with the specific, practiced confidence of a man who had written versions of this report before and understood how the language of official documentation could be made to carry weight that the underlying facts sometimes couldn't support on their own. His report was not a series of lies in the raw sense of deliberate fabrications created from nothing. It was something more technically sophisticated and more institutionally dangerous, which was a translation of real events into a professional language that reshaped their sequence and their causation and their meaning without technically departing from anything that could be proven false by a single data point in isolation. The subject had been observed behaving in a manner inconsistent with the expected activity patterns of the residential area. The subject had initially declined to provide identification in a timely manner. The subject had been verbally uncooperative when asked to step away from the vehicle. The subject had required physical assistance to comply with a lawful order to present himself for a standard stop and identify interaction. Each phrase was a small architecture of implication, built on a foundation of selective emphasis, and Pruitt assembled them with the ease of long practice, his pen moving steadily across the report form, his posture, the relaxed posture of a man who had concluded a successful operation and was recording it for the files. At the adjacent desk, Jesse Albright was also writing. Jesse's supplemental report occupied the same form, the same boxes, the same bureaucratic structure as Pruitt's, but its contents were so different in almost every factual particular that someone reading both documents without knowing they described the same event could reasonably have concluded they did not. Jesse wrote that the subject had been observed engaged in the lawful activity of washing a privately owned vehicle on a private residential driveway. He wrote that the officer had initiated contact without a call for service or an observed violation. He wrote that the subject had complied with every request for identification in a timely manner. He wrote that the subject had asked appropriately and legally what crime he was suspected of committing, and that no specific criminal allegation had been articulated. He wrote that the subject had stated repeatedly and clearly that he was not resisting, that he was compliant, and that the physical contact initiated by the officer was unnecessary and disproportionate to the circumstances. He wrote all of this carefully, and when he reached the end of the form, he sat for a moment with his pen resting on the paper and looked at what he had written, which contradicted his training officer's report in ways that could not be reconciled, and which, when submitted through the department's documentation system, would attach his name and badge number permanently to a record that said, Wade Pruitt had lied. He submitted it anyway. He pressed the button. He felt in the moment after he pressed it something that was not quite relief and not quite fear, but was in the territory between them the specific sensation of having done something that could not be undone, and that you were not sure was the right thing until it was already done. And then you were more sure than you had been before. Roger Slayton, the union representative, had arrived 18 minutes into Pruitt's report writing, called by a number that Pruitt had dialed from his personal phone in the first 2 minutes after parking the cruiser in the bay. Because the call to the union was a reflex that officers like Pruitt had trained themselves into across years of learning which resources existed and how quickly they needed to be invoked. Slayton was reading the report over Pruitt's shoulder with the focused, technical attention of a man whose entire professional value lay in his ability to identify procedural vulnerabilities before they became structural ones. And he had already suggested 2 small language adjustments that Pruitt had incorporated. Adjustments so minor that they would not appear as corrections in any comparison of drafts, but which had the cumulative effect of making the causal sequence of events slightly less clear in the places where clarity was dangerous. Sergeant Haley watched from behind his desk without appearing to watch, which was something 19 years behind a booking desk had made him very good at. 2 rooms away, Darius Cole was setting down a telephone. The 2 unmarked black sedans arrived in the District 3 parking lot at 9:48 a.m. and parked in the 2 spaces nearest the front entrance, which were technically reserved for command vehicles, and which had been, until this morning, an abstract category rather than an operational one, in the Saturday morning context of a district station house that ran at reduced administrative capacity on weekends. From the first sedan, Chief Leonard Marsh in command uniform, 4 gold stars on his collar, catching the October morning light as he stepped out and walked toward the building's front entrance with the deliberate pace of a man who was moving at exactly the speed he intended to move, and who had decided in the car how he was going to enter a room, and was now executing that decision. Marsh was 61 years old and had spent 35 years in the Calverton PD, the last 8 as chief. And in those 35 years, he had developed the particular kind of institutional intelligence that is different from both book intelligence and street intelligence, and which is perhaps best described as the ability to read a situation's full dimensions simultaneously. What it is, what it will become, what it will cost, what it will require, and to respond to all 4 dimensions at once, rather than sequentially. He had understood all 4 dimensions of this situation within approximately 30 seconds of Darius Cole's phone call, and the understanding had arrived with the specific physical sensation that chiefs of police experience when they realize that something has already happened that cannot be undone, and that the only remaining variable is how completely and how quickly the institution responds. From the second sedan, Detective Carla Brixton of Internal Affairs, 44 years old, with a case satchel over one shoulder and the expression of someone arriving at a work site that requires her full attention, followed by 2 IA investigators carrying laptops and a portable evidence documentation kit. All 3 of them moving with the specific, unhurried efficiency of professionals who had been called to situations like this before, and who understood that efficiency and speed were not the same thing, and that the situation required the former. Sergeant Haley met them at the interior security door. The exchange was brief, conducted in voices calibrated to carry no further than the 3 feet between them. Haley told Marsh what he had found in the system when he had found it, what Pruitt was doing right now, and had been doing for the past 47 minutes, what Jesse Albright had submitted through the documentation system 40 minutes ago, and what the current status of the property processing room's occupant was. Marsh listened without interrupting. When Haley finished, Marsh closed his eyes for a count that Brixton later described as exactly 3 seconds. She counted them because she was a detective, and counting was a reflex. And then he opened them and asked Haley where Commander Cole was being held. Haley led them down the hallway to the property processing room and stopped outside the door, and Marsh opened it and stepped inside. And the moment he saw Darius sitting at the laminate table in a faded Howard University t-shirt with the marks of the handcuffs still red on his wrists, the chief of police of Calverton, Virginia, stopped walking. He did not say anything for what felt like a long time. He stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at the man sitting at the table, and then he looked at the red marks on the wrists, and then he looked back at the man's face. And he did not have the words for what he was looking at, which was not simply a procedural error of staggering magnitude, but something older and heavier, and more structurally significant than any single error, something that had been building for longer than this morning, and longer than 14 months, and longer than the specific career of the officer currently in the bullpen completing his arrest report. Darius looked at him and said without preamble and without waiting for Marsh to find words of his own, "Close the door, Leonard. We have work to do." Marsh closed the door. Brixton set her case satchel on the table. Her investigators opened their laptops. And the work began with the specific, quiet efficiency of people who had been trusted with something important and intended to honor that trust by doing it correctly, rather than quickly. The first order from Brixton to her investigators was evidence hold body camera footage, Cruiser 44, 90-day window, effective immediately. Before any authorized access request was processed through the standard chain, and before anyone in the building with a reason to be concerned about that footage had the opportunity to be aware that it had been held. The second order was duty roster. District 3, current patrol assignments. Officer designation, J. Albright. She wanted his supplemental report pulled and read before she spoke to anyone else in the building. The third order was full personnel file. Officer W. Pruitt, badge 2247, Harlan County Records. Requested through Interstate Documentation Protocol. She turned to Marsh. She said, "How long has Pruitt been in this district?" Marsh said, 14 months? She said, I need the supervisory review logs for every complaint filed against a District 3 officer in Kessler Park in the past 18 months. Marsh told her who the watch commander was who had been responsible for those reviews. Brixton wrote the name down. Lieutenant Gary Edel. She underlined it once. With the door closed and the investigators working at their laptops, Darius laid out what he needed from this situation. Not what he was legally entitled to, not the minimum that the institution was required to provide him, but what he needed. In the way that a commander who has been doing this job for 28 years understands the difference between resolving an incident and addressing what produced the incident. He needed Pruitt to finish the report. He needed it complete, submitted, signed with his badge number attached and his name at the bottom. Every line filled in. Every characterization of events committed to in writing, because the report was the foundation of everything that came after. And a completed signed report could not be walked back in arbitration, the way a verbal account could be modified and contextualized and softened by a skilled union representative who arrived early enough to shape the narrative before it was committed to paper. He needed the confrontation to happen in the open. This was the point he made most carefully, and it was the point Marsh received most quietly, because it was the point that most directly contradicted the institutional reflex that every administrator develops over years of managing situations that could become problems, which was to contain, to limit exposure, to manage the smallest possible version of the truth in the smallest possible room. Darius had spent enough of his career managing the smallest possible version of difficult truths to understand that the smallest possible version was exactly how you got to a situation where an officer filed 3 complaints over 14 months, and each one was reviewed by a supervisor who made them smaller and smaller until they disappeared. And then the same officer stopped a man on his driveway on a Saturday morning and did not know why that should be any different from every other morning he had done it. He said to Marsh, I need every officer on this shift to see what happens when the institution takes this seriously. Not a rumor, not a memo, not a disciplinary action that gets processed in a back office somewhere. I need them to see it. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yes, sir. And then he said something that Darius had not expected, which was, You're right. I know you're right. I should have been making this clearer for longer than this morning. Darius accepted this without comment, because there was no useful response to it, and because the morning ahead required forward motion rather than retrospective accounting. And he moved on to the third thing he needed, which was Jesse Albright. He needed Jesse separated from Pruitt before anything happened in the bullpen, brought to a different room, given the opportunity to understand what was coming and to make a clear-eyed decision about his role in it, before the pressure of the moment made clear-eyed decisions harder. Not to coach him, not to tell him what to say, to give him the option of saying what he already knew, before the institutional machinery started moving, and the option became more complicated. Marsh sent someone to find Jesse. Brixton looked up from her laptop. She said, The evidence hold is confirmed. 90-day window on Cruiser 44 is locked. She said, Pruitt's Harlan County file request is submitted. Preliminary return in approximately 30 minutes. She said, Lieutenant Edel is going to have a problem. Darius said, I know. She said, How big a problem? He said, Tell me what the supervisory review logs show, and I'll tell you how big. She went back to her laptop. The station house was running its Saturday morning operations in the bullpen 40 feet away. And in the bullpen, Wade Pruitt was putting the finishing touches on an arrest report that Roger Slayton had read twice and found from a union procedural standpoint defensible, which was the best outcome Slayton had been able to identify given the available materials, and which was going to prove to be a significant overestimate of what the available materials could support. The mockingbird on Whitmore Lane was probably still singing. The hose was probably still dripping. The Camaro was sitting in the morning sun with its passenger door closed. Now Renata would have seen to that, and probably gleaming, because Darius had done 2 good passes before the cruiser arrived, and the October light was excellent for that kind of chrome. Jesse Albright came through the door of the conference room, expecting a debriefing, which was what the officer who had collected him from the bullpen had said it was, a routine supplemental interview, standard procedure, when a stop resulted in booking. And he walked in with his notepad in one hand and his personal phone in his breast pocket, and the expression of a man who was maintaining control of his face through significant effort. He saw who was sitting at the table. The control of his face broke completely. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway with the color going out of his expression in a slow, comprehensive way. And then he said something that was not quite a word. And then he said, "Sir, I." And Darius raised one hand, and Jesse stopped. Darius said, "Sit down, Jesse." Jesse sat. Darius looked at him for a moment without speaking. Not the silence of judgment, but the silence of someone allowing another person to settle into a room before the room began to demand things of them. And then he said carefully and clearly, "I am not here to trap you. I'm here to give you something that was not available to me on that driveway this morning, which is a choice that you can make before the consequences arrive, rather than after." "Do you understand what I mean?" Jesse said. "Yes, sir," Darius said. "The body camera footage is already in evidence hold. Your supplemental report is already in the documentation system. The footage from a civilian camera positioned across the street is already in my chain of command's possession. Everything that happened on that driveway this morning is already on the record in ways that will not change based on what you say in this room." He paused. "That means that what you say in this room does not need to be about survival. It can just be about what you saw." Jesse looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. Darius said, "Did Officer Pruitt have legal basis to initiate that stop?" Jesse said, "No, sir." The answer was immediate, and it was complete, and it had the specific quality of something that had been waiting to be said for a long time and was finally allowed to be. And Darius recognized that quality because he had seen it before, in people who had been holding something back and had finally found the room and the permission and the structure to put it down. The conversation that followed lasted 22 minutes. Jesse described 6 stops he had witnessed over the past 6 months. Stops in Kessler Park and the adjacent Elmwood district, all involving black motorists or pedestrians, all with pretextual justifications articulated after the stop rather than before it. 2 formal complaints filed by the stopped individuals and submitted through the standard process, both subsequently reviewed and resolved at the supervisory level, before reaching the division command, which was Lieutenant Gary Edel's level, which was the level where Brixton was currently building her second line of inquiry. And then Jesse told Darius about the locker room. 3 weeks after Pruitt's transfer, he said he remembered because it was the day after the first time he'd watched Pruitt make a stop he couldn't justify, and he had spent that morning trying to decide whether what he'd witnessed was a pattern or an incident. And the locker room conversation had answered the question. Pruitt had been talking to another officer, a man named Dawes, who had since transferred out. He had been talking about Kessler Park and about the residents who had moved into the neighborhood recently, and he had used a specific racial epithet, and he had said something specific about the residents, about what he considered their presence in the neighborhood to represent, and about what he intended to do about it from a patrol perspective. Jesse had been around the corner of the locker bank. He had not announced himself. He had pressed record on his personal phone. He said, "I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if it was enough. I didn't know who to give it to." He reached into his breast pocket and took out his phone and set it on the table in front of Darius. Darius looked at the phone. He said, "Is the recording on this device?" Jesse said, "Yes, sir." Darius said, "Don't touch it." He opened the door. He said, "Detective Brixton, I need you in here." At 11:17 a.m. on a Saturday in October, the bullpen of the District 3 station house was running at the particular pace of a weekend morning shift, reduced in volume and complexity compared to a weekday. The phones ringing at intervals rather than continuously, the detectives at their desks working through carryover reports, 2 civilian administrative staffers processing paperwork at the far end of the room. The desk sergeant, handling intake with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who had done this so many times that the routine had become nearly invisible. Wade Pruitt was at his desk, with Roger Slayton beside him, the arrest report completed and submitted. His coffee in one hand and his posture carrying the specific, settled quality of a man who had finished the work he came to do and was now in the comfortable aftermath of it. The part where the institution processes what he has given it and returns the expected validation. He was not expecting anything that came next. The corridor door from the administrative wing opened, and Chief Leonard Marsh walked into the bullpen. The room responded the way rooms always respond to the entrance of the highest-ranking person in the building, when that entrance is unexpected and unannounced, which is that it went very still, very quickly. Conversations dropping off mid-sentence, keyboards going quiet, people turning in their chairs or looking up from their papers, the whole room reorganizing itself around the new gravitational center. Marsh was followed by Detective Carla Brixton, who was followed by two investigators with laptops under their arms. And then behind Brixton came a man in a faded Howard University t-shirt and athletic shorts. The room took approximately 4 seconds to process what it was seeing, which was the same amount of time it took Wade Pruitt. And the processing happened in stages, the way all difficult realizations happen in stages. First, the recognition that the man was familiar, that he was the man from the driveway, that he was the man from the back of the cruiser and the booking area. Then the recognition that he was walking into the bullpen in the company of the chief of police and an internal affairs detective. Then the specific, terrible, irreversible understanding of what that combination meant. The color left Pruitt's face from the bottom up, which is the opposite of the way blushing works, and which is therefore a more complete event. Roger Slayton saw Pruitt's face and looked toward the corridor door, and then looked at Slayton's own notepad, and began the rapid internal calculation that union representatives performed when they realized the available procedural exits were fewer than they had estimated, which was an expression that involves no color change, but a specific tightening around the eyes that communicated the same essential information. Darius stopped in the center of the room. He did not look at Pruitt yet. He looked at the room, at the officers who had stood when the chief entered and were still standing, at the detectives who had come to their doorways, at the desk sergeant standing very straight behind his counter, with his hands flat on the surface in front of him. And he took one full breath, and then he spoke. His voice filled the room the way his voice always filled rooms, without effort at the volume it needed to be, and no higher. The kind of voice that people turned toward, not because it was loud, but because it carried a quality of attention that made you want to be inside it. He stated his name and rank and title. He said, "I am the commanding officer of every officer in this room." He said, "At 7:49 this morning, I was stopped in my private driveway on Whitmore Lane by an officer of this department while engaged in the lawful activity of washing my personal vehicle. I was asked to identify myself without legal basis, ordered away from my own property without cause, and placed in handcuffs and transported to this station on charges that I will describe now, and that you should understand are entirely without factual foundation." He named each charge. He described what had actually occurred in sequence, without embellishment or emotion, the way a man who has been trained to give testimony gives testimony, specifically and completely, in a voice that treated the facts as sufficient. Then he looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was standing behind his desk with his hands at his sides, and the particular stillness of a man who had converted all his energy into the single project of not letting his legs collapse beneath him. Darius said, "Officer Pruitt, you stopped me this morning because of what you saw when you looked at me. I want you to hold that in your mind right now, and I want you to think about every other person who lives on that street, or drives through that street, or parks on that street, who you have stopped for the same reason, and who did not have what I have on the other side of that building. Think about what happened to them. That is what this department has to answer for. Starting right now, starting today, starting with you." The room was completely silent. Marsh stepped forward. He asked for Pruitt's badge and service weapon. Roger Slayton stood up. He stood up with the specific energy of a man who had rehearsed this particular role many times in many different rooms, and who understood that the first 45 seconds of a union response to a departmental action were the most important 45 seconds in terms of establishing the procedural framework that would govern everything that followed. And he began with the language that union representatives in law enforcement had refined over decades into a nearly airtight form. The arresting officer had been acting within the parameters of his training. The stop had been a good faith application of patrol discretion in a neighborhood with documented theft history, and any physical escalation had been a proportional response to a non-compliant subject. And the department's own protocols required that the administrative process be followed before any action against the officer was taken. And the union demanded that process be followed. He said all of this in approximately 35 seconds. Then he stopped, because Marsh had not stopped moving. Marsh was walking across the bullpen toward Pruitt, and his face had the expression of a man who had heard every version of this argument over 35 years, and had reached the specific point in his professional life where he no longer needed to argue with it, because he had the authority to simply act. And acting was what he was doing. He stopped in front of Pruitt. He said, "Weapon and badge, now." Slayton said, "Chief, the contractual process requires—" Marsh turned and looked at Slayton with the expression of a man who had been very patient for a long time, and had concluded that patience was not the tool the moment required. He said, "The contractual process will run in parallel, Roger. The badge and the weapon come off before that process begins, because the badge and the weapon are not Officer Pruitt's property. They are the department's property, and I am the department, and I am telling him to take them off." He turned back to Pruitt. Pruitt reached for his duty belt. His hands were shaking, not dramatically, not in a way that could be called a performance, but in the specific involuntary way of a man whose nervous system had received information that his conscious mind was still refusing to fully accept, and whose body had already accepted it completely. The duty belt came off. The holster came with it. The badge pin required 2 attempts because his fingers could not manage the clasp on the first pass. He held the badge out. Marsh took it. He did not look at it. He handed it directly to Brixton, who put it in an evidence bag, with the specific matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this was the expected next step. Darius had watched all of this from the center of the room, without moving, without altering his expression, without allowing himself the satisfaction of the moment that would have been the easiest and least useful thing to allow himself, because satisfaction was a closed state, and the room still needed something from him that required an open one. He looked at the room, not at Pruitt, not at Marsh, not at Slayton, but at the officers standing at their desks, some of whom he knew, and some of whom he recognized from division reports, and some of whom were entirely new faces. And he understood that what he said next would settle into this building and stay there, in the way that things stay in rooms where something permanent has happened. He said, "No one here is being blamed for Officer Pruitt's decisions, but everyone here is being asked to understand something this morning that I want to be very clear about, because clarity is the only thing that actually changes culture, and changed culture is the only thing that actually changes outcomes." He paused. Every complaint that was filed in the past 14 months about patrol practices in Kessler Park was handled at the supervisory level and did not reach my desk. I want to know why, and I want to know who made that decision, and I want to know what other decisions like that one have been made in this precinct in the past 18 months, and Detective Brixton is going to find out. He looked at the officers. This is not a threat. This is an accounting. Institutions that cannot account for themselves cannot be trusted with the power they hold. And we hold significant power. The only thing that makes that power legitimate is the willingness to hold it accountable. We are holding it accountable today. He looked finally at Jesse Albright, who was standing near the wall with his notepad in one hand and his eyes on the floor, bearing the specific weight of a young man who had done several things correctly and one important thing wrong. and was not yet sure which was going to define what happened to him. Darius said, "Officer Albright." Jesse looked up. "You submitted an honest supplemental report under your own name this morning, knowing that it contradicted your training officer's account. You preserved a recording from 3 months ago that you did not know how to use, but kept anyway, because you understood it might matter. You did those things when the easier thing, the safer thing, was not to do them." A pause. "You also stood by on a driveway this morning when someone needed you to do more than stand by." Jesse's jaw tightened. "Both of those things are true, and both of them are part of your record, and I want you to carry both of them forward, because the one that you choose to let define you is still your choice to make." He looked at the room one more time. Then he looked at Marsh. He said, "Chief Marsh, I'd like my property back, please." The investigation that followed was thorough in the particular way that investigations are thorough when they begin with a complete evidentiary record and expand from there, rather than beginning with a partial record and attempting to reconstruct what the partial record cannot supply, which is the difference between building a case and verifying one. Dorothy Crane's tablet footage ran for 16 minutes and 43 seconds and captured in clear, uninterrupted, high-definition video the complete arc of the encounter, from the moment Pruitt stepped out of the cruiser to the moment it pulled away from Whitmore Lane, including the retention strap release, the unlawful physical contact, the handcuffing, and the specific tightening of the cuffs that was visible in the footage as a second deliberate motion of Pruitt's right hand after the initial close of the mechanism. Jesse Albright's cell phone recording, once authenticated by the department's digital forensics unit, provided both audio of the locker room conversation and metadata confirming the date, time, and device identification that established its provenance beyond any procedural challenge that Slayton subsequently raised. And Slayton raised all of them, with the professional thoroughness of a man who understood that his job was to find the exits, and that this particular room had very few. The body camera archive from Cruiser 44 provided what Brixton later described to Marsh as a fairly comprehensive self-documentation of 14 months of the problem. Because Pruitt's body camera footage, reviewed in its full 90-day window and then extended to the full archive upon request, showed a pattern of stops, 6 confirmed in Kessler Park alone, additional incidents in the adjacent Elmwood district that shared the same fundamental characteristics: black motorists or pedestrians, no stated legal basis for the initial approach, pretextual justifications articulated after contact rather than before it. And in 3 of the 6 Kessler Park incidents, physical contact or the explicit threat of physical contact before any non-compliance had been established. The supervisory review logs that Brixton had requested told the story of what happened to those stops afterward, which was that they arrived at the desk of Lieutenant Gary Edel and were reviewed and resolved at that level without reaching the division command, resolved in the specific sense that the complaints were processed through a sequence of administrative steps that produced no disciplinary outcome, at no flag in the officer's personnel record, which was not an accident and was not an oversight. Edel's email records obtained through the department's internal communications archive on a warrant that the district attorney's office turned around in 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon showed correspondence with Slayton about 2 of the complaints during the review period, correspondence in which the language of the complaint was discussed in terms of its procedural vulnerabilities rather than its substantive claims, in terms of what could be challenged rather than what should be investigated. The Harlan County personnel file arrived via interstate records request on Sunday morning and contained 3 excessive force complaints, 1 civil settlement in the amount of $22,000 paid by the county's liability fund, and a supervisor's note in Pruitt's annual review, describing him as effective in high-pressure environments, but requiring additional coaching on community relations protocols in diverse residential settings, which was the kind of language that said something clearly enough to anyone willing to read it, and clearly enough to no one who wanted to avoid reading it. D.A. Patricia Holden opened her parallel review on Monday morning and called Brixton by 9 a.m. to discuss the locker room recording which she had reviewed over the weekend, and which she said in language precise enough to carry professional weight and direct enough to make the point clearly represented, significant and contemporaneous evidence of racial animus predating the incident, which, in combination with the pattern of stops, constitutes a basis for enhanced civil rights charges under federal statute. Jesse Albright gave his deposition on Tuesday in a conference room at the district attorney's office, with his own attorney present, an attorney he had retained Sunday morning, using money from his savings and a short-term loan from his father, the football coach from Richmond, who had said when Jesse called to tell him what was happening, "Tell the truth, the whole truth, and let the truth do its work. That is the only play." Jesse told the whole truth. He did not recant a detail. Roger Slayton's 4 procedural challenges to the locker room recording were filed Monday through Thursday of the following week and denied on Friday morning by a magistrate who wrote in the denial order that the authentication chain was complete, the content was relevant, and the objections raised were without merit under the applicable rules of evidence, a finding that Slayton received with the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had filed the challenges anyway, because his job required that he exhaust every available option, which he had now done. Lieutenant Gary Adele was placed on administrative leave on Wednesday of the same week, pending a separate investigation into his supervisory conduct in relation to the buried complaints, and he hired his own attorney on Thursday. And by the following Monday, the attorney had begun preliminary conversations with Brixton's office about what cooperation might look like and what cooperation might produce, which was the beginning of a different kind of accounting. The weeks had a particular quality during this period. Not quite the quality of momentum, which implied speed, but something more like the quality of a weight that had been suspended for a long time, beginning to descend steadily and in the direction that gravity intended, with the specific irreversibility of something that has been set in motion rather than held in place. Darius went back to work on Monday morning. He came in through the front door in uniform, the same way he always came in. The coffee appeared without being requested. The conversations in the hallway adjusted their register when he walked through. He stopped at his adjutant's desk and asked Philippa Osei whether Dorothy Crane's original complaint was in the file. Philippa said it was. He said, "Make sure it's referenced in every document that comes out of this investigation." She said, "Yes, Commander." He went into his office and closed the door and sat down at his desk and opened his email and began to work. The formal disciplinary hearing convened 6 weeks after the driveway, on a Tuesday morning in the Calverton Municipal Complex, in the hearing room on the 4th floor that was used for administrative proceedings of sufficient gravity to require a retired jurist rather than a departmental hearing officer, which this proceeding had been designated by joint agreement of the City Attorney's Office and the Police Department's legal counsel, a designation that communicated through the specific grammar of procedural choices that the parties involved understood what they were dealing with. The hearing officer was Constance Waller, 70 years old, a retired federal magistrate who had spent 32 years presiding over proceedings in which people attempted to use procedural language to avoid substantive accountability, and who had developed through that sustained exposure a particularly refined impatience with the gap between what language said and what the available evidence showed. She wore no expression that could be read as either sympathetic or hostile. She wore the expression of someone for whom the outcome of a proceeding was determined entirely by the record before her, which was a quality that made her both highly useful and, from the perspective of the parties with procedural arguments rather than factual ones, deeply inconvenient. Roger Slayton presented the union's case with the full competence of a man who had built a professional life on finding exits from rooms that appeared to have no exits, and who had spent 6 weeks looking for the exit in this particular room. The stop had been a good faith application of patrol discretion in a neighborhood with documented theft history. The physical escalation had been a proportional response to perceived non-compliance. The officer had not known the identity of the subject, which was relevant context for his state of mind and his assessment of the situation. The filing of the arrest report represented the officer's honest account of the events as he understood them. Slayton was thorough. He was also aware because 30 years in this work had given him the ability to read the room accurately, even when the room was not giving him what he needed, that thorough was not going to be sufficient. Rixton presented the IA findings with the specific, unhurried precision of someone who did not need to argue because the record argued for itself. And she let the record argue. The body camera footage time-stamped and authenticated. Dorothy Crane's 16-minute tablet recording authenticated and complete. Jesse Albright's supplemental report filed in real time through the department's documentation system, before any review had been initiated. The locker room recording authenticated by the digital forensics unit and supported by the metadata chain that established its provenance. The full personnel file from Harlan County entered into the record, with its 3 complaints, its civil settlement, and its supervisor's note. The pattern of 6 stops in Kessler Park documented through the body camera archive, with the specific demographic and procedural commonalities that the pattern revealed. Patricia Holden spoke last, and she spoke briefly, which was the sign of someone who understood that the record had already made the case, and that additional words were not an improvement on it. She said the criminal referral was drafted. She said the federal civil rights charges were being filed in coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office. She said the enhanced basis for those charges, the racial animus documented in the authenticated recording, in combination with the documented pattern, had been reviewed and confirmed by federal prosecutors who were prepared to proceed. Constance Waller asked one question. She asked it of Roger Slayton. She said, "Counselor, in the officer's own testimony and in the account he provided in his arrest report, is there any basis, factual or inferential, for concluding that the stop would have been initiated if the subject had been a white male resident of the same neighborhood, engaged in the same activity, in the same circumstances?" Slayton paused. He was a professional, and professionals do not say things that make their situations worse, when they can instead say nothing, and let the silence make its own record. He said, "I don't believe the officer's testimony speaks to that question directly, Hearing Officer Waller." She said, "No, it doesn't." She closed the folder in front of her. She said, "Officer Pruitt is terminated from the Calverton Police Department, effective immediately. His law enforcement certification is referred to the State Board for permanent revocation proceedings. The matter is forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office as reflected in the DA's submission. Lieutenant Gary Edel is reduced in rank to sergeant and placed on final warning with the specific notation that any subsequent supervisory failure in the handling of civilian complaints will result in immediate termination proceedings. The department is required as a condition of continued Civilian Oversight Board certification to implement mandatory body camera activation protocols, revised community policing training across all precincts, and an anonymous complaint escalation pathway that bypasses supervisory review for any complaint involving an officer with prior documented complaints." She looked at the room. The purpose of this hearing was not to decide whether what happened on Whitmore Lane was wrong. The footage establishes that beyond the reach of any procedural argument, the purpose was to decide what the institution does with what happened. The institution's response will be judged not by what it said in this room today, but by what it does in the rooms that come after. She picked up her pen. She signed the decision. She handed it to the clerk. Across the table, Wade Pruitt sat in civilian clothes, with his hands in his lap, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who understood what he had done wrong. It was the expression of a man who understood with a completeness that arrived too late to be useful, that the institution he had believed would protect him had in fact been changed at some point over the past 3 years in ways he had not paid close enough attention to, and that the change had consequences that extended all the way to this room. He did not speak. He had nothing left to say that the record had not already said for him. Wade Pruitt entered a plea to a lesser count of civil rights deprivation under color of law in federal district court 11 weeks after the hearing, accepting 2 years probation and the permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification, in exchange for the dismissal of the enhanced charges, a resolution that his attorney described as the best available outcome given the evidentiary record, and that produced for Pruitt a life in which the specific professional identity he had built his entire adult self around no longer existed, and would not exist again in any jurisdiction. He moved back to Harlan County, where his father was still living in the house where Pruitt had grown up, and did not speak publicly about what had happened on Whitmore Lane. And the quiet he maintained was the quiet of a man who had run out of versions of the story that made him the reasonable one. Jesse Albright's probationary period was extended by 6 months, a consequence he accepted because it was fair, and because the alternative, the consequence that had been available before the hearing, established what his actions had cost the department, had been considerably worse. When the extension concluded, he transferred within the Calverton PD to a community policing unit that operated out of the District 2 precinct, under a supervisor who had served under Darius for 9 years, and who ran the unit with the specific, unglamorous patience of someone who understood that trust between a community and its police department was rebuilt in small increments over long periods of time, and could not be rushed without being broken. Jesse became, over the following years, quietly and without fanfare, the kind of officer he had come to the academy to be. Not because the path had been easy, but because he had learned on a driveway on Whitmore Lane the cost of being any other kind. Dorothy Crane gave one interview to a reporter from the Calverton Courier-Journal who drove to Whitmore Lane 3 days after the hearing and rang her doorbell and asked if she had anything to say. She stood in her doorway with Frances at her feet and said that she had been watching that street for 22 years, and that she had known what she was seeing when she saw it, and that she was glad the tablet had been charged. She and Darius had coffee on her front porch 2 weeks after the hearing ended, on a morning mild enough to sit outside, and they talked about her late husband, who had been a school administrator for 30 years, and about what the neighborhood had been when she moved to it, and what it was becoming, and what it still needed to become. And the conversation ran long enough that Renata brought a third cup across the street and pulled one of the porch chairs from the front of Dorothy's house and sat down and joined it. And the three of them stayed there until the afternoon light changed and Frances fell asleep across Dorothy's feet. And nothing that was said was historic. And nothing that was said was small. 6 weeks after the driveway, on a Saturday morning in late November, when the oak trees on Whitmore Lane had given up their last leaves, and the light came in low and amber through the bare branches, and the air had the clean, cold edge of a morning that meant what it said, Darius came out of the house in the same faded Howard University t-shirt. Renata had tried to throw it away once the previous spring, adding it to a donation bag on the kitchen floor with the matter-of-fact decisiveness she applied to objects that had outlived their practical usefulness. And he had retrieved it from the bag that evening without mentioning it, folding it back into the drawer where it lived, because there was no useful explanation for why he needed to keep it. That was not also an explanation for why he had been washing a car on a driveway in Kessler Park on an October morning in a worn-out t-shirt, rather than anything that communicated his rank and his title and the 28 years of work that had produced them, which was that some mornings he simply needed to be ordinary, to be the man he would have been if the world had been a different shape, and the t-shirt was part of that. He carried the same bucket. He filled it from the same hose. The Camaro was in the same spot, and the morning light did to its paint what the morning light always did, which was turn it into something that looked like deep water, dark and deep, and full of the specific still kind of beauty that does not announce itself, but waits to be noticed. He was not thinking about Pruitt, not in the way that thinking about something means it still holds. He had done the institutional work and the legal work and the command work, and he had made his peace with the pace of change that all of it had produced, which was the pace of a large thing moving in the direction it needed to move, not as fast as the moment required, but faster than it had been moving before the moment, which was the best available description of progress in any institution that had not yet finished becoming what it was capable of being. He was thinking about his mother, Gloria Cole, who had worked 6 days a week for 23 years and whose hands had smelled like antiseptic soap, and who had never seen him make commander, but who had told him when he was 9 years old the thing he was still living by, the thing he had been living by on the driveway when Pruitt walked across it, and again in the property processing room, and again in the bullpen, and again in the hearing room, and again every morning in between, because the instruction did not have an expiration date, and did not depend on the circumstances being favorable. It was simply a description of what a life had to be, in order to be worth the living of it. Make sure your soul is worth seeing. He thought about Jesse Albright, who had sent him a handwritten note, not an email, a handwritten note on a piece of plain white paper, in careful, close cursive, that said in one paragraph that he was grateful for the conversation in the conference room, and that he understood now that the thing he had been avoiding was not the cost of speaking up, but the cost of becoming the person who didn't, and that he intended to spend the rest of his career paying that second cost instead of the first. He thought about Dorothy Crane's complaint, sitting in a review queue for 3 weeks before the driveway resolved it for everyone. And he thought about the policy change that had come out of the investigation, requiring that any complaint involving an officer with prior documented complaints bypass the supervisory review level entirely and proceed directly to divisional command, which was a change that had cost Adele his rank and had cost the institution a significant amount of procedural discomfort, and would prevent, over the years that followed, an unknown number of situations from developing into the situation that had occurred on Whitmore Lane. Unknown, because they would not occur, and the things that do not occur leave no record of themselves. He dipped the chamois into the water and began with the hood. The hood was where he always began because it was the largest panel, and because the morning light hit it at the most useful angle for seeing whether the previous pass had left any streaks, and because beginning with the largest thing set the rhythm for everything that came after, which was a principle that applied to more than car washing. Through the kitchen window, Renata moved past with her coffee mug and her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head, and she stopped for a moment at the window and looked out at him, and she raised the mug slightly, a small, private salute, the gesture of a woman who had been married to this man for 20 years and understood, without needing it explained, every particular significance of what he was doing on that driveway, on that morning. And then she moved away from the glass and was gone. The Marvin Gaye station was playing from the open garage because Darius had turned it on before he came outside. The same station, the same songs they had always been before October, and would remain after October. Music that was built from tenderness and exhaustion, and the particular ongoing question of its best-known title, the question that did not resolve, but that the asking of kept something alive that needed to stay alive. He worked the hood in slow, wide circles. At the far end of Whitmore Lane, where the street curved to the right before meeting Caldwell Avenue, a patrol cruiser turned the corner and came up the block. Darius did not look up. He kept working. The cruiser moved at the deliberate pace of a residential patrol, neither rushing nor loitering, the pace of an officer covering a sector rather than hunting in one. The difference audible in the engine speed and visible in the way the vehicle tracked straight down the center of the lane, without drifting toward any particular driveway. It slowed as it approached the house, the natural deceleration of a vehicle making a visual scan, and Darius kept his eyes on the hood panel, the chamois moving in its circles, because he was not going to look up out of anxiety, and he was not going to look up out of defiance, and he was not going to look up for any reason other than the same reason he always looked up, which was that something had happened that was worth looking at. Then the window came down. The officer inside was young, early 20s, a face Darius placed after a moment from a use of force training session he had conducted across all 4 precincts 3 months ago. The session had run long, and this particular officer had asked a good question near the end about the difference between de-escalation and appeasement, a question that had required a careful answer. The officer raised 2 fingers from the steering wheel, not a wave, not a salute, not a performance of anything. Just 2 fingers lifted briefly from the wheel in the particular way that people acknowledge each other on roads, when they share something. A common road, a common neighborhood, a common morning. Darius straightened up from the hood. He raised one hand. The cruiser continued down Whitmore Lane and turned left at Caldwell Avenue. and was gone. The mockingbird started from the oak tree at the property line, the one that went quiet when the first cruiser came, and had come back since, calling into the November morning with the particular cheerfulness of a bird that does not track human drama and finds the morning good regardless. The hose dripped on the concrete. Darius turned back to the Camaro. He had 2 wheel wells left, and the rear bumper, and the chrome trim along the passenger side, and the morning was still young, and the light was good, and the water in the bucket was clean, and the chamois was soft, and the work, when you let it be, just the work, was a kind of prayer that required no words, and answered itself. He dipped the chamois. He began. If this story moved you, if you recognized something in it, or someone, or felt the particular satisfaction of watching patience and integrity outlast arrogance and unchecked power, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this one exist because the people inside them chose the harder thing when the easier thing was available. Subscribe to our channel and stay with us for more stories about justice, accountability, and the kind of courage that doesn't always announce itself, but changes everything when it finally speaks.